They expected bullets. Instead, they got soup. The line of prisoners stretched across a white wasteland, thousands of shadows trudging through the snow, bent under the weight of their defeat. The Reich had collapsed behind them, and the Red Army's iron tide rolled endlessly westward. What had once been proud divisions were now nothing more than columns of frost-bitten men, hollow-eyed, wrapped in rags that had once been uniforms. Above them, a gray sky hung silent, indifferent. Below, boots sank into a crust of ice that swallowed the sound of everything, except the coughs, the dragging steps, and the occasional low moan that escaped from somewhere in the line. The war had promised them glory. Now it offered only survival. And even that they doubted. The men knew what they had done in the East, and what the Soviets must have thought of them. Rumors had followed every step of their retreat, that no German prisoner would live to see home, that mercy had no place beyond the Volga, that those who surrendered would be shot where they stood. As the Red Army trucks appeared on the horizon, engines coughing clouds of black smoke, every man in that frozen procession braced himself. No one spoke. They expected retribution, execution, a final reckoning for the ashes of Stalingrad, for the villages burned, for the names buried in snow. When the Russians stepped down from the trucks, rifles slung, faces unreadable behind scarves and frost, the prisoners stood motionless. Then came a command, sharp, incomprehensible, and they were herded toward a cluster of field tents surrounded by barbed wire. The fear was total. Every movement, every glance from the Soviet guards felt like judgment. The Germans waited for the gunshots that would end it, but none came. Instead, what drifted toward them on the wind was not the sound of rifles, but the unmistakable smell of something cooking. For a moment, confusion rippled through the ranks. It was impossible. The scent of boiled cabbage, onions, and something richer beneath it. The Soviets were stirring great metal cauldrons set over stoves, the steam rising like ghosts into the air. One guard shouted again, gesturing toward a line. The Germans hesitated, afraid it was a trick, but hunger had its own logic. Slowly, the first few prisoners stepped forward, tin cups trembling in their hands. What they received was hot soup, thin, watery, but hot and real. For the first time in months, perhaps years, warmth touched their skin from the inside. The liquid burned their throats, made their eyes sting. Some wept silently as they drank. Around them, the guards watched without expression, standing in their heavy coats, rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders. No smiles, no words, just the act, a ladle dipped, a cup filled, the next man called forward. In that instant, the world became unrecognizable. The prisoners had marched through a landscape of hatred and vengeance, and yet here, in a clearing surrounded by snow and wire, they were being fed. It didn't fit into anything they believed. The paradox would haunt them long after the war. The soup was not kindness, not exactly. It was something older, colder, and more deliberate. The Soviets had learned that a starving enemy did not need punishment to break. He needed routine, ration, exhaustion, and the slow corrosion of time. And so the bowls were filled, not as a gift, but as a mechanism, a way to keep men alive just long enough to become ghosts of themselves. Still, to those who drank it that day, it felt like mercy. Night fell early on that camp. The prisoners, still dazed, were herded into crude barracks, wooden walls lined with straw, no heat. Somewhere outside, a generator hummed, and the smell of smoke and soup lingered in the air. They lay in silence, their minds circling one thought. Why hadn't they killed us? The Red Army officers who oversaw the camp had their orders. They were not to execute prisoners unless commanded. The Soviet Union had plans, massive, logistical, merciless plans, to use the German captives as labor, to rebuild what had been destroyed. Every man, even the weakest, was a tool to be consumed in the machine of reconstruction. So the soup kept flowing. At dawn, the guards moved among the barracks with buckets and orders shouted in Russian. The prisoners rose, bones aching, frost clinging to their breath. They were lined up again, counted, divided. Some were sent to dig trenches, others to load timber. They moved through the snow like automatons. The memory of that first bowl of soup, its heat, its salt, its brief illusion of humanity, became an anchor in their minds. They began to understand something terrible. Survival itself could be a form of punishment. As the days turned to weeks, the rhythm of captivity replaced the rhythm of war. The uniforms rotted, the ranks vanished, the idea of Germany itself dissolved into the monotony of labor. What remained were men, stripped of every symbol that once gave them identity. But still, at the end of each day, came the soup. Steam rising into the freezing air, the metallic scrape of ladles against iron. The smell that made them remember, for a few fleeting seconds, what it felt like to be human. They didn't know it yet, but that simple act, that bowl of soup, would become one of the defining memories of German prisoners who survived the East. It was the first sign that the war was no longer about enemies or allies. It had become something else entirely, a study in what humans could endure and what they could forgive. They would later say that the soup tasted of salt and smoke, like the war itself had been boiled down and poured into a tin cup. The first nights in Soviet captivity were a descent into something beyond exhaustion. The men were not yet prisoners in the physical sense. They were still walking, still breathing. But inside, something had broken. It wasn't defeat on a battlefield that crushed them. It was the realization that history had reversed. The victors were no longer them. The cold, the silence, and the indifferent machinery of the Red Army made it clear that they now existed only by permission. The camps were not places of chaos. They were organized in a way that felt almost impersonal. There were rules, schedules, numbers, ledgers. Men became entries on lists, their fates reduced to rows of ink. It was not hatred that defined their days. It was procedure. The Soviet system was methodical, relentless, and vast. Every morning, at dawn, a bell or shouted order jolted them from shallow sleep. The guards herded them outside, breath forming pale clouds in the air. They were counted again and again, head counts, roll calls, verifications. Each time the same monotone numbers echoed back, a chorus of weary voices that once belonged to soldiers but now belonged to laborers. The work began immediately. Digging trenches through frozen ground, clearing snow from railways, carrying logs, stones, or whatever the camp commandant required. Hunger followed them everywhere. The soup they were given was little more than sustenance, barely enough to keep a man upright, but it became the center of their existence. A man could think about nothing else. During the day, the mind would wander. Some remembered families they would never see again. Some recited prayers they had forgotten during years of conquest. Others thought only of the next meal. The Red Army guards watched from the edges, wrapped in heavy coats, smoking silently. They did not shout unless necessary. They didn't need to. The cold did their work for them. Yet there was something unexpected, something that disturbed the Germans more than any cruelty could have. The Soviets did not seem interested in revenge. The men had expected beatings, executions, torture. Instead, they received a mechanical kind of indifference. It was not mercy, but it was worse. It meant they were no longer important enough to hate. Every now and then, a rumor would pass through the camp. A transport had arrived from the west, a new group of prisoners from Königsberg, a colonel from Stalingrad still alive. The rumors gave the illusion of movement, of a world still turning. But time in captivity was circular, days repeating like snow falling on the same ground, erasing all tracks. The soup remained constant. At midday, the same ritual. Men lining up with tin cups, steam curling into the air, the faint smell of barley and cabbage. The guards ladled without looking up. Each man received his portion, turned, and walked away. The entire scene lasted minutes, but in those moments, the world shrank to a single bowl. To the Soviets, the act of feeding was logistical. To the prisoners, it was spiritual. The soup was proof of life, the one thing the Red Army could not fake. It was warmth made visible. And in that warmth, something began to shift, slowly, quietly, dangerously. Some prisoners started to question what they had believed. The propaganda that had filled their years in uniform, images of Slavic inferiority, of a ruthless enemy, now dissolved in the face of this strange, unspoken civility. A man could hate an enemy who struck him, but how do you hate one who feeds you? It didn't erase guilt. It magnified it. Among the officers, shame began to spread like frost. They remembered the burning of villages, the executions, the hunger they themselves had inflicted upon the land they now stood on. And now, here they were, starving, broken, and being handed food by the same people they once condemned as subhuman. In the dim light of the barracks, some wept without reason. Others stared into the dark, unable to sleep, the smell of soup still clinging to their thoughts. Outside, the Red Army trucks came and went, engines humming like the pulse of a giant machine. The Soviet officers kept records, stamped forms, logged supplies. To them, it was all part of a process. But within that process, something profoundly human had emerged, an accidental mercy. In the East, mercy was rare, and when it appeared, it was often mistaken for a trick. The Germans expected cruelty because they had earned it. The soup confused them, destabilized their certainty. It made them confront a truth that no ideology could shield them from. The enemy was still human. As winter deepened, frost crept into every corner of the camp. The temperature fell to -30. Men slept in clusters to preserve heat. The guards patrolled in silence, their breath forming halos in the dark. The only sound that broke the night was the metallic clang of ladles in the morning, announcing that the day had begun again. The war, outside, was nearing its end. Berlin was already a ghost. But here, deep inside the Soviet Union, time had lost all meaning. The prisoners did not know who ruled or who had fallen. Their world had narrowed to a handful of routines: count, work, eat, survive. And yet that single bowl of soup each day had begun to do what guns could not. It was reshaping the prisoners from the inside. They no longer marched as soldiers. They trudged as men. By February, the snow around the camp no longer looked white. It had turned gray with ash and footprints, frozen solid into a crust that would not melt until spring. The men had stopped noticing the cold. It was simply part of their skin now. They no longer talked about going home or about the front. Their world had shrunk to a few hundred meters of wire and timber and the thin trails of smoke that rose from the field kitchens. Each morning began the same way. The guards would walk past the barracks, boots crunching against ice, tapping the doors with rifle butts. Inside, the prisoners would stir, pulling themselves from the straw like ghosts. They no longer looked like soldiers of the Reich. Their hair had grown wild, their uniforms were rags. Some had tied strips of cloth around their feet in place of boots. And yet, when the bell rang for soup, they still stood straight in line. The smell of boiling vegetables was enough to pull men back from the edge. Even the sick would crawl out to stand under the falling snow, clutching their tin bowls. The Soviet cooks worked without expression, stirring vast metal pots over stoves fed with scavenged firewood. The guards kept order, their rifles slung lazily, watching the line move. Steam rose, hands trembled, and each man stepped forward to receive his portion. It was not enough to live on, but it was enough not to die. That thin difference became the rhythm of existence. Some men began to talk again, quietly, in fragments. They spoke of the war as if it had happened to someone else. One had fought near Minsk, another in the ruins of Kharkov. They spoke of comrades lost, of officers who had vanished, of the strange moments when the front collapsed and no one knew where Germany ended anymore. Every man had a version of the story. None of them matched. Occasionally, the camp gates would open for a convoy. Trucks arrived carrying supplies or prisoners from another sector. The newcomers always looked worse, emaciated, burned, hollow. The veterans of the camp would watch them stumble through the snow, remembering the first time they themselves had crossed that line. They recognized the same expression: fear mixed with disbelief. When the new men tasted the soup for the first time, they reacted just as everyone had: confusion, relief, shame. It was a pattern the older prisoners could now read in the faces of others. First suspicion: was it poisoned? Then hunger: was there more? And finally, that strange private collapse when the heat from the cup reached their hands and something inside them broke. In the Red Army's reports, these moments were never mentioned. The paperwork spoke only of numbers: how many captured, how many alive, how many fit for work. But the truth of captivity existed in sensations: the smell of boiled cabbage, the metallic taste of the bowl, the sound of wind scraping across the camp's barbed wire. For the Soviets, the camps were a necessity, not a statement. The motherland was ruined, cities in ashes, and every pair of hands had value. German POWs became a workforce that stretched from Ukraine to Siberia. They built railways, cleared rubble, cut timber in frozen forests. Many would die doing it. But the system endured, efficient in its cruelty and indifferent to morality. Among the prisoners, a few tried to find meaning in that indifference. Some called it justice, others called it fate, most simply stopped calling it anything. What haunted them most was not violence, it was kindness without warmth. The guards did not curse them, rarely struck them, but neither did they care. When a man collapsed, they would drag him aside and continue the count. When someone died overnight, the body was removed before dawn and replaced with another number on the list. Life and death became administrative, and yet, each evening, the soup returned. There was something ritualistic about it now. The ladle dipping, the line moving, the men's breath steaming in the air. It gave shape to their days, a rhythm that anchored sanity. Even those near death tried to stand when the bell sounded. The act of holding a cup, of waiting one's turn, became a final connection to order. Sometimes, when the cooks were careless, they would drop a piece of potato into a bowl, and the lucky man who received it would hold it in disbelief. That single fragment of solid food became treasure. Men traded bits of bread, a glove, a spoon, anything for such moments. It was said that in captivity, one learned the true scale of human hunger, not only for food, but for meaning, for proof that existence still mattered. The soup, thin and tasteless as it was, became a symbol of that proof. In the months ahead, those who survived would describe that first act of feeding not as compassion, but as awakening. The soup taught them something about survival they had never known in the army, that life could persist without pride, without identity, without purpose, only through the stubborn act of continuing to breathe. When night fell and the wind rose across the camp, the men lay listening to the sound of stoves dying down. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked, and the faint light of a guard's cigarette glowed near the wire. In that silence, one thought returned again and again. They had expected bullets, and still the Russians gave them soup. It was mercy they could neither accept nor refuse. Spring came late. When the snow finally began to melt, the camp revealed what winter had buried. Beneath the drifts were the bones of boots, scraps of cloth, and the outlines of graves marked only by sticks. The smell of thawing earth mixed with smoke from the kitchens. For the first time in months, the prisoners could see color, mud, rust, dull green shoots pushing through the ground. Work changed with the season. The men were marched out to repair roads, to clear rail lines swallowed by ice. They carried shovels instead of rifles, but the discipline was the same. Orders barked in Russian, formations broken and reformed, counts taken at dawn and dusk. The rhythm of captivity was precise, designed to wear the will down slowly, predictably. Yet even in that machinery of control, small moments slipped through. When the sun rose higher, the guards sometimes loosened their coats, revealing medals, photographs, tokens of lives beyond the wire. One prisoner remembered seeing a guard take a small tin picture from his pocket, his wife perhaps, and stand silently, looking at it before returning to duty. The moment was gone in seconds, but it remained in memory, a reminder that both sides had been devoured by the same war. Food remained the axis around which the day turned. The soup never changed. It was the one thing constant enough to seem eternal. Some men began to talk about it as if it were alive, a creature that kept them suspended between life and death. A few prisoners managed to work in the kitchen area. They learned that the soup was made from whatever the camp could find: cabbage leaves, barley, sometimes the bones of old horses from the Red Army's supply dumps. They stirred the cauldrons, inhaling the steam that would soon reach their comrades. They could taste it before anyone else, but none dared to take more than allowed. Theft meant execution, and the Soviets enforced that rule without hesitation. Still, to serve was to survive. The cooks became witnesses. They saw the guards up close, heard the conversations in Russian, gruff, weary, human. They learned that most of these men had seen things just as terrible as the prisoners had. Burned villages, dead children, comrades frozen stiff in trenches. Some had lost entire families in the war, and yet they still ladled soup for their enemy. In the barracks, rumors of home drifted like smoke. Germany, they heard, had fallen. Hitler was dead. Berlin was ashes. The war was over. But for the prisoners, nothing ended. The wire remained. The same lines, the same ladles, the same taste of salt and ash. Time continued, indifferent. At night, under thin blankets, men dreamed of food. Not of soup, but of bread, of the sound of crust breaking, of butter melting. They would wake in darkness, the taste still in their mouths, and realize that even memory could betray them. Some prisoners began to write. Using scraps of paper, bits of charcoal, they recorded what they saw, the routines, the faces, the contradictions. One wrote a single line again and again: "They fed us." He didn't know if he meant it as accusation or absolution. By summer, disease spread. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. The camp's infirmary was a tent lined with cots made from boards. Doctors among the prisoners, former medics, surgeons, worked with nothing but rags and melted snow. The Soviets supplied what they could, but shortages were everywhere. When a man died, he was buried beyond the fence, his number scratched into a wooden plank. The living learned not to look too long, and yet each death deepened the meaning of the soup. The survivors saw it not just as sustenance, but as proof they had escaped one more day. To eat was to live. To live was to remember. Sometimes, when the guards were off duty, a kind of uneasy calm settled over the camp. The prisoners would sit in the open, faces to the wind, silent. They no longer spoke of revenge or justice. They spoke of weather, of insects, of the way the light looked on the wire. The war had stripped them down to simple observations. The Red Army officers kept their distance, but they watched. To them, these men were no longer soldiers. They were labor, and labor was valuable. Mercy was efficient. A man fed today could work tomorrow. But beyond that calculation, there was something unspoken, a weariness that hung over victors and captives alike. Both sides had seen too much. The act of giving soup, repeated endlessly, had become a language between them, one that said what words could not: enough. As months turned to years, the prisoners changed. The hatred that once defined them thinned like the soup itself. They still longed for freedom, but when they closed their eyes, they no longer saw battlefields. They saw a pot steaming in the cold and a ladle moving slowly from one cup to the next. For many, that image would outlast the war. It would be the thing they remembered most clearly when they finally walked free, the moment they realized that survival did not come from strength, but from the quiet shock of being spared. The years after 1945 blurred together like one endless season of waiting. No one in the camp could say for certain what month it was anymore. The calendar had become meaningless. There were only two states of being: before soup and after soup. Everything else was routine. The prisoners were thinner now, reduced to angles and shadows. Their eyes had that distant glaze seen in those who have lived too long in limbo. And yet, somehow, they endured. A man could adapt to anything if it happened slowly enough. When new prisoners arrived from other fronts, they came with stories that sounded like echoes from another world. Some spoke of the Americans, how their camps were cleaner, their rations larger, their guards friendlier. The men in the Soviet camps listened, but they no longer envied anyone. Comparison belonged to the past. Here, life and death were measured in spoons and shovels. The work expanded. As the Soviet Union rebuilt its cities, the prisoners were sent outward, to mines, to railways, to construction sites where the ruins of war were being turned into foundations for a new empire. The soup followed them everywhere. In every location, the same smell, the same ritual. It was as if the entire machinery of post-war reconstruction was fueled by those iron cauldrons. Sometimes, when men were transported between camps, they saw glimpses of the countryside, the burned-out villages, the endless plains, the faces of civilians watching from doorways. Some of those faces were hostile, some empty, some filled with a strange pity. The Germans had once marched across this same land with fire and banners. Now they passed through it as ghosts. Among the prisoners, a hierarchy emerged, not of rank, but of endurance. The strongest helped the weak. The ones who remembered how to organize, barter, or repair things became invaluable. A man who could fix a stove, stitch a boot, or scavenge extra fuel could buy another week of life. In the absence of war, survival had become its own battlefield. Letters from home were rare. When they did arrive, they were censored, the words blacked out by Soviet ink. Sometimes, Only a single sentence remained legible: "We are alive." The prisoners would pass those scraps from hand to hand as if they were sacred relics. For days afterward, the camp would feel almost human again. By the second winter, men began to die more quietly. There were no longer cries or protests. They simply stopped moving. A comrade would shake them awake at dawn, and the body would remain still. The guards would come with a cart, and life continued. The soup was served as usual. But beneath the monotony, something subtle had shifted. The Germans had expected to be erased by hate. Instead, they were absorbed by indifference. That realization began to gnaw at them. To be hated was to matter. To be ignored was annihilation. Some of the older officers, who had once commanded battalions, found their thoughts turning toward confession. Not to priests, there were none, but to the act of remembering itself. They began to write small diaries in secret, describing not just what they endured, but what they had done. The paradox was too great to ignore. They had marched east as conquerors, believing themselves superior, and now they stood humbled before the people they had sought to destroy. And still, the Russians fed them. The daily soup became a symbol of something greater than either side understood. It was the slow, silent victory of survival over ideology. Each ladle served was an act of defiance, not against the Germans, but against the brutality that had consumed both nations. Occasionally, a guard would speak a word or two of German, a command, an insult, or sometimes a warning. But rarely, there was something softer. Once, when frostbite claimed the fingers of a young prisoner, a Soviet medic treated his wounds with a gentleness that shocked everyone. The man later said that the touch hurt more than the pain itself, because it reminded him he was still alive. The camp was not mercy, it was endurance. But in that endurance, something resembling redemption began to take root. By the third year, many prisoners stopped counting the days. They no longer asked when they would go home. The concept of home itself had become abstract. They had been remade by captivity into something the war had not intended, men who no longer believed in absolute enemies. When spring came again and the cauldrons steamed over the open fires, the act of eating had become sacred. It was no longer just about food. It was memory, guilt, survival, and strange gratitude all at once. They expected bullets. Instead, they got soup. And that simple inversion, repeated day after day, became the quiet rewriting of everything they thought they knew about war. The longer they lived, the more they realized that survival itself carried a kind of sentence. To live was to remember, and remembering meant never escaping. The war had ended, but it was still inside them. And every evening, when they cupped their hands around the tin bowl and felt its warmth seep into their bones, they understood. History was not written in battles or victories, but in the moments when men chose not to kill. When word finally came that some prisoners were to be released, it did not spread through the camp as joy. It spread as disbelief. The rumor started one morning when a Soviet officer arrived with papers stamped in red, and a small group of names was read aloud. The men stepped forward, hesitant, as if expecting a cruel trick. For years, nothing had changed. Freedom was not a word anyone trusted. But the trucks did come. They watched as those selected, thin, bearded, cheese hollow but shining, were loaded into open vehicles, blankets draped over their shoulders. No one knew where they were going. Some whispered home, others muttered another camp. The air was thick with envy and dread. For every man who left, 10 remained, staring at the exhaust smoke as it faded into the distance. The next morning, the same soup was served, the same routine continued, as if nothing had happened. That was how captivity worked. It erased exceptions. Even the miracle of release became just another story to survive through. By then, the camps had begun to stabilize. Death was rarer, disease more contained. The Soviets had learned that keeping prisoners alive was more useful than burying them. Construction projects multiplied. The Germans built bridges, power plants, dams. They mixed concrete in the name of the same state that had once sworn to destroy them. For some, work became purpose. It was not loyalty, but inertia. To build was to occupy the hands, to silence the mind. One group of engineers, former Wehrmacht specialists, were sent to help rebuild a railway destroyed during the war. They worked alongside Soviet civilians, men and women who had lost everything. There was no friendship, only necessity. Yet the proximity changed something. At noon, both sides gathered near the same field kitchens. The cook served everyone from the same pot: Germans, Russians, Ukrainians, all fed by the same ladle. For the first time since 1941, the line between enemy and ally dissolved into steam. No one spoke of it. They simply ate. It was in those moments, some said later, that they first understood the quiet transformation taking place. The war had been fought to define who was human and who was not. But the aftermath showed the opposite. Humanity survived precisely because it refused definition. In the barracks, men grew older. Time stretched out like the steppe, featureless, endless. The young soldiers of 1941 were now gray and stooped, their faces carved by cold and hunger. Some still carried medals hidden beneath their rags, symbols of a past that now felt almost absurd. The Reich had promised eternity. Captivity had delivered reality. Occasionally, visitors came: delegates, inspectors, officials from Moscow. They walked through the camp with notebooks, observing, recording. To them, this was data, another number in the reconstruction of a broken empire. But for the prisoners, those visits meant something else. They were a reminder that the outside world still existed, that history was moving on without them. And yet, the daily act of feeding remained untouched. The cauldrons bubbled, the lines formed, the ladles dipped. No command could erase that rhythm. It was both punishment and salvation, a ritual that tethered life to repetition. The men who survived the longest were not the strongest, but those who accepted the monotony. They stopped fighting the days and learned to live inside them. Survival became a discipline, a quiet, almost monastic endurance. Sometimes, at dusk, a prisoner would stand near the fence and watch the horizon bleed red over the snowfields. The same sun that had set over Stalingrad now sank here, over the silent camp. It made no distinction between victor and vanquished. In those hours, the men thought about what awaited them if they ever returned home. Would they be welcomed, feared, forgotten? Most assumed they would carry the mark of the East forever, a shadow that would follow them through every conversation, every silence. They had gone to war believing themselves the chosen. Now they would return as witnesses to their own unmaking. One former officer, writing years later, described it this way: "The Russians gave us soup, and in that soup was everything we had denied them: pity, endurance, and a strange kind of strength. We thought it weakness. We were wrong." Yeah. When the first snow of another winter began to fall, the prisoners barely noticed. It was only when the kitchens began burning extra wood again that they realized the seasons had turned. The smoke rose thicker, the smell stronger. Another year would pass before the next release. But the soup never changed. It was the only thing that survived the war without an ideology. And in that simple act, the feeding of one man by another, the meaning of victory itself began to shift. The Germans had lost the war. But in the slow, indifferent mercy of the camps, they found something they had never expected: the chance to understand it. By the fourth year, the camp had become a world unto itself. New faces arrived, older ones vanished. The guards rotated, the commandants changed, but the rhythm stayed exact: work, count, soup, sleep. The sound of ladles scraping metal and boots crunching on frozen ground had replaced speech. It was the language of survival. For many, memory began to dissolve. Names of battles, of streets, of songs, everything that once made them men of a nation faded into a blur. What remained was habit. They rose when ordered, marched when told, ate when called. The war had taught them to obey. Captivity had taught them to endure. Sometimes, when the evening wind carried the scent of pine from beyond the wire, an ache would stir. It wasn't homesickness, not exactly. Home itself had become an uncertain idea, but a longing for the ordinary, the feel of a chair, the sound of a door closing, the weight of a spoon made for more than survival. Those memories hurt more than hunger. The Russians, too, had changed. The guards were no longer soldiers fresh from battle. They were men absorbed by duty, bound by paperwork. They treated the Germans neither kindly nor cruelly. They simply managed them. Some were barely older than the prisoners had been when the invasion began. The war that had shaped their fathers was, for them, already turning into legend. Once, during repairs on the camp fence, a guard offered a cigarette to a German worker. The man hesitated, unsure whether to accept. The guard shrugged, lit one for himself, and left the other balanced on a post. Small gestures like that were dangerous, officially forbidden, but they happened nonetheless. They were the cracks through which humanity leaked. Inside the barracks, the prisoners built small worlds. A few carved chess pieces from bits of wood. Others wove baskets or mended tools. The act of creating something, anything, was rebellion against erasure. When a man finished a carving, he would stare at it as if to remind himself that he still existed. The soup remained the anchor. Even when supplies ran low and the taste changed, sometimes thinner, sometimes bitter, it marked the turning of the day. A man could close his eyes and know where he was in time by the sound of the pot lid being lifted. For the newcomers still haunted by combat, that sound was a promise. For the veterans of captivity, it was a liturgy. Letters arrived again, sporadic, fragile. They told of ruins being rebuilt, of families scattered, of children grown. Some brought hope, others brought silence. One man learned that his wife had remarried, believing him dead. Another discovered that his hometown no longer existed, erased by firebombing. The war had outlived the front lines. And yet, each day that a letter was read aloud, men gathered to listen, as if the words could rebuild what the world had destroyed. The guards didn't interfere. They stood aside, watching the strange ceremony of enemies sharing grief. When spring came again, the earth thawed early. Mud replaced snow, and with it came smells long forgotten: wet soil, smoke, the faint sweetness of grass. To the prisoners, it felt like the world itself was breathing again. They began to hope quietly that perhaps the end of their captivity would come with the season. In Moscow, negotiations had begun for repatriation. The prisoners didn't know this, but the Soviet state had started to weigh the cost of keeping them. Railways were rebuilt, factories repaired, labor was less scarce now. The German captives had served their purpose. Soon, some would be returned, not all, but enough to make it seem merciful. When the news reached the camp, it arrived not as a speech, but as a list. Names read by a tired officer, each syllable foreign in his mouth. The men stood motionless, listening for a word that might mean them. For those not called, there was the familiar sting of hope denied. For those chosen, there was fear. Freedom had become something to distrust. The night before departure, the selected men were allowed a second portion of soup. It was a gesture, symbolic, bureaucratic, perhaps even sincere. They ate slowly, tasting every mouthful. Some wept, others stared into the steam, remembering the first bowl years ago. They had expected bullets. Instead, they got soup, and now, after all this time, the same act marked their return to life. The next morning, the trucks rolled out. The rest of the camp watched in silence, the sound of engines fading into distance. The guards returned to their posts. The kitchens resumed their work, the ladles clanged. The lines formed. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Those who remained felt the strange calm of survivors who had learned not to measure hope in miles or years, but in bowls. Each day's ration was another victory, small, invisible, but real. Beyond the fences, spring kept moving north. Spring kept. The snow melted from the rivers. The smoke from the kitchens rose into clear sky. Somewhere unseen, the world was starting again. Inside the wire, men waited, listening for the familiar sound that meant they were still alive. The slow, steady rhythm of soup being poured into metal cups. The journey home began in silence. Those chosen for release climbed into the trucks without looking back, afraid that if they met the eyes of those still behind the wire, the trucks might stop. The engines roared, and the columns rolled through the gates that had framed their lives for years. The guards saluted briefly, not out of respect but out of habit, and the convoy disappeared into the gray horizon. For the men left behind, the emptiness that followed was heavier than the years of captivity. The camp felt too large now, its sounds too few. The barracks seemed to echo with the absence of voices. Work continued as always, but even the guards looked older, slower, as if the purpose had drained from the place. The soup line still formed, but it moved differently, less desperate, more ritualistic. The act had become almost sacred, a memorial to those who had left. The men who remained would sometimes whisper the names of the departed before stepping forward for their ladle, as though the memory might travel with the steam. For those on the trucks, the world outside the wire felt unreal. They crossed forests, villages, endless plains. Some had not seen a city in half a decade. When the convoy stopped at stations for water or repairs, civilians gathered to watch, women with scarves tied against the wind, children clutching bread crusts. Some threw stones, others simply stared. The prisoners understood. They had once looked at others that way. As they moved westward, the scars of the war unfolded before them. Burned churches, cratered fields, rivers clogged with rusting metal. The silence of the land was worse than any sound. It was as if the continent itself had stopped breathing. At night, under canvas tarps, they spoke softly. What would home look like? Who would be there? Would anyone forgive them or believe them when they said that their captors had fed them, not shot them? The war had taught them to expect hatred. Mercy was harder to face. Days later, the first groups reached the border. Soviet officers handed them to Allied control. There were signatures, stamps, and orders read aloud in languages that felt foreign. Then, without ceremony, the men were told they were free. But freedom was a strange word now. They had forgotten what it meant to choose. Their first steps beyond captivity were uncertain, almost reluctant. Some knelt and touched the ground, others just stood, staring into nothing. The world was loud again. Train whistles, voices, dogs barking. It frightened them. In the years that followed, as more camps emptied, tens of thousands of German prisoners trickled back across Europe. They arrived thin, silent, unrecognizable, even to their families. Some carried small notebooks filled with memories, sketches, fragments of poetry written in the cold. Most carried nothing but the habit of survival. When they tried to describe what had happened, the words never seemed enough. They spoke of work, of hunger, of endless snow. But what they remembered most was the soup. Always the soup. The way it had appeared when they expected death. The way it had come again and again, indifferent, inevitable, human. To those who listened, it sounded almost trivial. But to the men who had lived through it, that small daily act was the difference between despair and endurance. It was the sound of civilization, faint but still alive, on the far edge of destruction. Many who survived captivity found themselves haunted not by cruelty, but by the absence of it. They could understand violence, they could not understand restraint. That confusion stayed with them, deepening into guilt. For some, it became unbearable. They had seen the enemy's face, and it was not what they had been taught to hate. Years later, in memoirs and interviews, they tried to explain. One wrote, "When the Russians gave us soup, they returned to us something we didn't deserve. They reminded us that humanity still existed, and that knowledge has never stopped burning." Another said nothing at all, leaving behind only a single drawing in his notebook, a metal bowl steaming in the snow. Back in the Soviet Union, the camps were dismantled piece by piece. The barracks torn down, the stoves removed, the fences coiled into wire again. The ground where the men had stood was left to grass and silence. The wind erased the footprints. But in the archives, the records remained: ledgers, lists, signatures, cold numbers that never mentioned the soup. To history, they were statistics. To those who lived, they were the proof that even in the darkest machinery of vengeance, a flicker of mercy had survived. And as they crossed the border, one thought followed every man. They had expected bullets. Instead, they got soup. And in that quiet exchange, they had seen the true shape of defeat, and perhaps the first glimpse of forgiveness. The war had ended long ago, yet for the men who returned from the East, it never truly did. They stepped back into a Germany that no longer existed. Cities were nothing but ash and scaffolding. Families had scattered, flags had changed. Some were greeted with pity, others with suspicion. The uniforms they had once worn were now symbols of shame. They had been prisoners of the Soviets, but now they became prisoners of memory. No one wanted to hear their stories. The world wanted victory narratives, not accounts of hunger and soup. When they spoke of the Russians giving them food, people turned away or smiled politely, as if the mind had invented mercy to soften guilt. The men learned to speak less. They folded their memories inward, like photographs hidden in a coat pocket. But the memory of that first bowl never left them. They could recall the smell, the temperature, even the way the steam curled into the winter air. It was as vivid as any battle. For some, it was more real than home. A few tried to write. Their words were spare, stripped of emotion. They described what had happened with the same precision they had once used in field reports: numbers, times, distances. Yet beneath the surface, something pulsed, a quiet astonishment that the enemy had spared them, had fed them. The simplicity of it defied every ideology they had believed in. Historians would later argue about motive. Was it strategy, a calculated decision to preserve labor for the Soviet reconstruction effort? Or was it, in rare instances, compassion, human instinct surviving under total war? The documents gave no answer. But the survivors knew the truth was simpler and harder to explain. It was both. It was neither. It was life continuing because it must. In the Soviet archives, some reports from camp administrators still survive. They speak of rations maintained, of discipline adequate, of workers in good condition for continued service. Between those dry lines, the entire moral weight of the war lies hidden. Behind every statistic was a face, a hand gripping a tin bowl, a breath visible in the cold. For the Russians, the feeding of the prisoners was not an act of grace. It was order. The state demanded survival because survival was useful. But for the men who received that soup, the meaning inverted. It was no longer the state's act. It became something deeply personal, almost sacred. A single moment when death stepped aside and life insisted on itself. Decades later, when these men were old, they would gather in small associations of former POWs. They met in modest halls, drank weak beer, and spoke of the same things again and again. Not the battles, not the leaders, always the camps, always the soup. They said that was where the war truly ended, in the moment when the defeated were fed by the victorious. That was when hate collapsed, when ideology shattered, when the idea of the enemy died. And yet none of them called it forgiveness. Forgiveness was too deliberate, too clean. What they experienced was more complex, a kind of coexistence of guilt and gratitude that could never be reconciled. The soup had not absolved them. It had simply refused to let them die without reflection. In interviews recorded in the 1980s, one survivor recalled, "It was the first time I understood that survival is not a triumph, it's a responsibility." He looked down as he said it, his hands trembling slightly. On the table before him sat a mug of coffee, steaming in the light. He stared at it for a long time before speaking again. "Every time I see steam rise, I think of that day. The Russians, the cold, the soup. I think about how easy it would have been to kill us, and how they didn't. That's what haunts me." The interviewer asked if he had ever forgiven them. The man smiled faintly. "You don't forgive mercy," he said. "You live with it." For those who returned from the East, that was the unspoken burden, to live not as heroes or martyrs, but as witnesses. They carried with them the memory of a paradox, that the most human act they had ever experienced came from the hands of those they had once dehumanized. Across Germany, monuments rose to battles, to victims, to ruins, but none marked the places where men were fed. No one carved stone to commemorate a bowl of soup. Yet, for those who had tasted it, it was the single image that defined the war's end. When they died, many left behind small keepsakes from their captivity: a spoon, a scrap of tin, a letter never sent. In attics and boxes, those relics still exist, silent testimonies to a moment when survival triumphed not by power, but by restraint. History records empires and armies, memory remembers the soup, and in that distinction lies the truth of what war really does. They expected bullets, instead they got soup. That sentence became a kind of legend, whispered among the survivors, repeated in interviews and memoirs until it sounded like a proverb. A simple phrase, too small for the scale of what it meant. Because beneath it lay the entire reversal of everything the war had taught them, that strength was not in killing, but in refusing to. For the men who lived through it, that first bowl in the snow was not the end of suffering. It was the beginning of understanding. They learned in the most brutal classroom imaginable that humanity was not destroyed by war. It was merely hidden beneath its ruins, waiting for someone to act against instinct and restore it. In the years that followed, they carried that memory like a shard of glass. It cut into every silence. It glimmered in every moment of peace. When they married again, when they raised children, when they walked through rebuilt cities, The smell of boiled cabbage or smoke would take them back to the frozen step, to the cauldron steaming beside the wire. They could still see the ladle moving, the guard's impassive face, the first sip burning down their throat. The world around them rebuilt quickly. Streets filled with laughter again, radios played music, and nations moved on. But the men who had stood in that soup line remained marked by a knowledge that few could bear to hear. They had seen what happens when hate exhausts itself, when vengeance runs out of energy and gives way to something colder, quieter, more enduring. In the Soviet records, the story never existed. It was reduced to logistics, prisoners fed, rations distributed. The moral weight of that act, its quiet defiance of the logic of war, was lost in the ledgers. But memory, unlike archives, is alive. It refuses to stay silent. And so, in the decades that followed, that moment resurfaced again and again, an unplanned testament that even amid ruin, the human instinct to preserve. Another life can outlast the instinct to destroy it. Historians call it an anomaly. Soldiers called it a miracle. Those who lived it called it a meal. For every man who stood in that line, the world was divided in two, before the soup and after it. Before it, they were soldiers, obedient, certain, armored by ideology. After it, they were something else entirely, survivors of mercy. That transformation was invisible to most, but it reshaped a generation in silence. Some of those men later became teachers, farmers, fathers. They spoke gently, moved carefully, lived without spectacle. When asked about the war, they would answer softly, "You wouldn't believe what the Russians did." Man. And when someone asked what they meant, they would pause, because to explain it fully would sound absurd. They would simply say, "They fed us." Those three words carried more weight than medals, more truth than speeches. It is easy to commemorate destruction. The world builds monuments to battles, to deaths, to endings. It is harder to remember restraint, to carve in stone the moment someone chose not to kill. But perhaps that is the truest monument of all. The quiet, unrecorded gestures that turn enemies into men again. If history has a heart, it beats in moments like that, in the space between revenge and mercy, where survival becomes revelation. The German prisoners who lived through Soviet captivity rarely called themselves victims. They understood that what they had received was not kindness, but a chance. A pause long enough to think, to feel, to remember. The soup was never a gift, it was a mirror. And in that mirror, they saw everything they had done reflected back at them, softened only by the fact that they were still alive to see it. Some wrote years later that the taste never left their mouths. Not because it was pleasant, but because it was real. It was the taste of consequence, of reckoning, of being human again after being something less. And so the story endures, not in textbooks or official histories, but in the fragile recollections of those who learned, the hardest way possible, that war's greatest paradox is not death, it is mercy. They expected bullets. Instead, they got soup. And in that single quiet act, they discovered what victory and defeat had both forgotten. That even at the edge of history, when everything is broken, the smallest gesture of decency can echo louder than any gunfire.